Dan and Amy, and the message on hydroxychloroquine ever since Trump proposed it as a possible therapeutic for COVID-19 patients has been one of everything ranging from we don't know to outright dismissal because President Trump proposed it. Many suggesting, many medical doctors and public health professionals suggesting that it may have some beneficial effect for some patients in certain stages of the disease, but it also carries risk, and the number one risk that's been talked about is cardiac risk.
Heart failure.
Well, the science has never settled. That's axiomatic, even though that's not how many on the left talk about science. That's because they're ignorant or political or some combination of the two. And so there's a study that's been done by a nonprofit that looked into all of the available research on hydroxychloroquine, particularly as it pertains to the associated risks. This was done by Dr. Chadwick Prodromos, who is the president of Illinois Sports Medicine and Orthopedic Centers. He's the medical director for the Foundation for Orthopedics and Regenerative Medicine Forum, which is the nonprofit that conducted this review that we're to discuss. And he's an assistant professor at Rush Medical College, the Department of Orthopedic Surgery. Dr. Prodromos, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
So you did this deep dive. What prompted it, number one? Who did it, and what'd you find?
I'm an orthopedic surgeon. Our foundation does a lot of work with stem cells, FDA studies, other things like that, which have been shown to be efficacious in inflammatory arthritis, things like rheumatoid arthritis. So we deal with the immune system a lot, and the drug hydroxychloroquine has been out there for 60 years. Trade name is Plaquenil. And, you know, it was interesting to me that Plaquenil has always had a reputation as a very mild and very safe drug. And I was talking to some rheumatologist friends of mine who said, you know, we've never seen a heart problem with this drug ever, and we don't get EKGs. So, I read the report from the FDA. They quoting, in light of ongoing serious cardiac adverse events and other potential serious side effects, yada, yada, risk, or outweigh the benefits. And they recommended that not be used except in hospitals. So I thought, well, let's see what the science shows. So our foundation did a comprehensive literature search, every article we could find on the heart and hydroxychloroquine. And so here's what we found in a nutshell. Number one, and I don't want to get wonky, but it changes something in the EKG called the QT interval, makes it longer. And this can predispose to something called torsade de pointe, which is a ventricular arrhythmia. Bottom line is that can be fatal. So the inference was made that because hydroxychloroquine changes the EKG, that people can die. However, we looked in the literature, and in every study we found, and we looked through hundreds of them, there was not a single, and is not, a single reported case of somebody actually dying from this arrhythmia. So while it does change the EKG in some people, there is still not a report of anybody dying. Furthermore, if you look into people like Didier Raoult, who's a famous, brilliant epidemiologist, infectious disease doctor in France, who's treated thousands of people with this, he takes the step of getting an EKG early. He monitors people. He's had great success. So the first point is that while the potential risk exists, it doesn't appear, if you're at least reasonably cautious, that people die. Now, it may have happened here and there, but if it does happen, it's rare.
Well, what
the
about
the second thing we found, which completely to our surprise, was that there were recent articles just in the last few years, good journals, good meetings, cardiology, rheumatology, that show that, in fact, it's cardioprotective and very cardioprotective. So, for example, substantial decreases in, because there's a huge literature of people who have used this for lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, other things. So, markedly decreased risk in cardiac events, decreased thromboses, decreased arrhythmias, it even decreases your cholesterol. There's even a study of pregnant women who were on this versus others, and they found that their babies were much healthier, fewer deaths, et cetera. So I talked to doctor friends of mine because I was surprised to find this, and vetted this by 8 or 9 very smart people. And I guess because the research is new, nobody knew. I think people still don't realize that it's cardioprotective. And then, of course, the fact that it is very safe if used well, particularly in light of the new study from Henry Ford showing that the drug cut the death rate in half when given early. I just thought it was something people should know about so they can use it without there being reservations.
Now, I know President Trump is still taking, I do believe, a hydroxychloroquine as a preventative measure. Have you have you studied any of that?
Yeah, well, so he took it early on. I thought I read someplace that he's recently stopped, but there are doctors, and I know many doctors who take it themselves. I have a brilliant infectious disease doctor, a colleague of mine, who I discussed this with, and she told me that she is afraid to prescribe it because it's so political, and she said her patients don't want to take it. And it's really a shame. Remdesivir, which looks like it works, great thing, about $3,100 per course of treatment. Hydroxychloroquine is 73 cents a pill, so we just kind of wanted to set the record straight.
I know you've got a medical degree from Johns Hopkins. You just mentioned you're an orthopedist, but you're not an infectious disease expert. And so those individuals that reviewed the study, the look-see that you did they include infectious disease experts?
They did. And it's interesting. They included infectious disease experts, rheumatologists, cardiologists. And so you have to realize, too, infectious disease doctors use this drug, but the drugs that they have the greatest expertise with are antibiotics. Mm-hmm. This is not. This is an immunomodulatory drug, very much akin to the work that we do with stem cells. So it's kind of a drug. Infectious disease doctors have learned about it and used it, but the rheumatology aspect of it was, at least as important. And then I've talked to other doctors, pretty well-known people who I won't mention here, people who are in the news who are using this, and I ran this by everybody and said, am I missing something here? And to a person, they said, we think these results look valid.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, of course, the FDA warned against using it outside of a hospital setting, but at the same time provided emergency use authorization for doctors to make the decision of its usage in consultation with their patients, and just the heat of opposition to its usage was so disproportionate to even an understanding of what we thought the threat level was. It seems to me distorted the conversation about this as a possible therapeutic, again, for some people at certain stages of the infection.
Yeah, that's true. And to be clear, so the doctors don't need authorization to prescribe it. It's FDA approved, off-label use, so you can use it. However, when they gave these guidelines, people can sometimes stick to them. And be aware, too, so we're conducting another study. We're not done with it, but preliminarily we've looked at all the studies of efficacy. And there is a trend that it is more effective used early. And this is what Didier Raoult had said, too. So the FDA guidelines, they're just guidelines, that say use it in the hospital is kind of the opposite of what should be done because you're using it at a point where it's much less likely, to be beneficial. One other thing I would just add briefly, it is often used with azithromycin, which is an antibiotic. And azithromycin also alters the EKG, and people had said that the effects might be additive as far as deaths. So I won't go into the research, but we looked at all the articles there, too, and it turns out that azithromycin also has not been associated with arrhythmia. In fact, there are even a couple papers pointing out that it's completely safe. But you're right. I think the people who put out the guideline meant well, but it absolutely distorted its use away from where it is beneficial.
There was a new study out from academics at Oxford, including an infectious disease expert, Jose Laurencio, and that looks at herd immunity threshold and argues that while it was widely believed the herd immunity threshold required to prevent a resurgence of COVID-19 is in excess of 50% for any epidemiological setting, they demonstrate that that may be greatly reduced if a fraction of the population is unable to transmit the virus due to innate resistance or cross-protection from exposure to seasonal coronaviruses. The HIT drop, the herd immunity threshold drop, is proportional to the fraction of the population resistant when that fraction is effectively segregated from the general population. So here again we say that it seems to me they're concluding that, look, if you protect the vulnerable, for example, top of the list, nursing homes and long-term care facility residents, and quarantine the infected, then you can get to that herd immunity threshold. That herd immunity threshold comes down effectively, and you can get on the other side of this viral spread.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, and I'm very glad you brought it up. And I will tell you, there were 5 studies that all kind of came out into the public watch 2-3 weeks ago that all impacted toward that point. The one you mentioned is one of them, great study. There was one from the University of Nottingham, which said that even taking all comers, the usual threshold that's discussed of maybe 60 or 70% applies to vaccines, and when they're spread by people, it's only about 43% they estimated. There was a study from the Karolinska, a very prestigious institute in Sweden, which found that they found 15% of people tested positive for antibodies only, but when they looked at T-cell immunity, the real immunity was 30%. So this is much closer to what you would need. There was a study from Germany which showed roughly 80% cross-immunogenicity, meaning you got some resistance just from having had colds. And the other thing that's a really important point that I've also been discussing with my epidemiologist friends is that people talk about herd immunity as though, well, you get to 65% and you're done, cured, right? But the thing that happens is that you have to realize there is kind of a sliding scale herd immunogenicity. Relates to what you just said, Dan. That if you can get some people to have the cases not get sick, young people in schools, for example, they will slow the spread of the disease. They will bend the curve, as it were. So this is a useful thing.
And so from all of the researching into the research that you've done and your colleagues have done at this nonprofit that you founded, have you drawn any conclusions about some of the other mantras, social distancing, mask wearing in particular, where the science is arguably dubious? And then, of course, you just mentioned it, the other question, any qualms about kids going back to school, and I mean back to school in classrooms with teachers in a learning setting, and with 30 kids in a room.
Yeah, I think there is consensus among experts, and of course, in Europe, virtually everybody's gone back to school. Among experts and colleagues, that kids should go back to school. They've studied contagion, doesn't seem to occur. I mean, I think you have to protect high-risk teachers, and people have to be careful not to bring it home to their elderly, ill grandparents. But yeah, I think kids should go back to school. But the other things you mentioned, the mask issue is controversial. I wear one. I'm a surgeon. I'm used to wearing one anyway. And I don't know. People have said maybe they don't help. Honestly, I don't know. Social distancing also. But the thing you have to realize is that social distancing, masks, all of those things help suppress the spread. And I think it's important to do some of that so that people don't get ill and overwhelm hospitals. But social distancing and masks don't kill the virus. The only thing that kills it is either a vaccine or some form of graduated herd immunity. So, going overboard, draconian measures to shield everybody, I think destroys society, doesn't get you where you want to go. So, as you said, protect the vulnerable people. With the other people, protect them a little, but don't go overboard.
Dr. Chadwick Prodromos, president of the Illinois Sports Medicine and Orthopedic Centers, medical director for the Foundation for Orthopedics and Regenerative Medicine, and assistant professor at Rush Medical College in the Department of Orthopedic Surgery. Dr. Prodromos, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a pleasure being here.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
thanks. It was very informative. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
This is the morning.